Welcome to The Roommate Coach. My name is Mark Lynn. I'll be your host here on KZZH 96.7 FM in Eureka, California. My motto, as well as my goal as the roommate coach, is world peace, one roommate at a time. Of course, if you're thinking of the larger world, it would be easy to dismiss my motto and my goal as pretty hopeless, at least for the foreseeable future. The thing is, I've got kind of a dual meaning when I say the world. I'm talking not only about the larger world, but also your world, meaning the time you spend with your roommates. And in that world, I think maybe I can make a difference if I'm able to give you some ideas about how to improve the way things go with your roommates. In that case, your world peace will have gotten better. This will be episode 8, in which I continue. I'm going to call this part 2 of my background, of the roommate coach background, continuing what I started last week, or I guess it was last week with episode 7. Pretty much just describing how I became the roommate coach, what I've done before this, and why I believe I am in a position to come up with some ideas and suggestions for ways to help roommates get along better. Now, speaking of episode numbers and titles, I'll give you my contact information here. If you want to give me any feedback, you could do that at theroommatecoach.com on the web. There's a contact link on the homepage. You could also leave a voicemail 24/7 at area 707-362-8000, 707-362-8000. And if you have comments about a specific show and you remember the title or the episode number, please include that, and that'll help me to understand your comments and to put them in context. I hope to have all the previous shows available online on my website and on YouTube in the fairly near future, and I will announce that here as soon as I get that done. Also, I'd like to mention that KZZH has been brought to the air fairly recently by Access Humboldt, accesshumboldt.net, and I'm grateful to them for not only getting the station on the air, but for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about my ideas and concepts as the roommate coach. In today's roommate coach episode, this is episode 8, I'm going to continue talking about my background. I'll start out with a brief summary of last week in case someone missed the show. Very briefly, my background I spoke about in part 1 of the series, in which I initially, it was my early experiences with my family conflict. This is probably not a terribly unusual story, by the way. I realized early in my life that I really, really disliked conflict, and I had strong suspicions, surprisingly early in my life, that they were largely unnecessary, and I even went so far as to say I thought they were stupid. The conflicts, not the people, but the conflicts themselves in many cases were just really ridiculous, and I wanted as little to do with them as possible. When I first began to make progress and began to really understand conflict and begin to have some hope that there might be something to be done about, much of it anyway, was when I got into therapy in my 20s as a young man, therapy with Nathaniel Branden. That turned out to be a fabulous experience for me. I can summarize the changes. There are basically 3 big things that are relevant to my decision to become the roommate coach, 3 things that happened as a result of my time in therapy with Branden and others, as a matter of fact. The main thing is I accomplished many of my personal goals. I became more self-confident. I got a much better idea of some of my inner conflicts and my inner struggles, disappointments, whatever. The trouble is, I think much of the time, I think most of us have some version of that, but most of the time it remains unconscious. And for me, that was the big advantage of being involved in therapy, is I brought some of that stuff out into the daylight where I could examine it a little closer and put it in perspective. One thing I did notice in myself, a big change as a result of doing therapy, is I became more tolerant of others. And I think that's also kind of a keystone thing in my ultimately becoming the roommate coach. I think tolerance, or more accurately, the lack of tolerance, has a lot to do with a lot of conflict among people and among roommates, along with other things. So all of this gradually led me to where I am today, which is talking to you about roommate issues as the roommate coach. So that was number one. The second thing I came away from my therapy days with was the conviction. This I would attribute to Branden's influence, and also Ayn Rand, controversial figure though she may be. I think she did an awfully good job of standing up for the idea of giving your life some meaning, of making your life matter. And no one can do that for you. You have to do that yourself. And I came away from my years of study with Branden and others just passionately convinced that I wanted my life to have some meaning. I wanted to do something of value. And the third thing, which I've already alluded to here, is I came away more convinced than ever that conflict, much of it, maybe most of it, maybe all of it, I don't know, but at least a lot of it, is unnecessary. And I don't think anyone who's paying attention to world events would be surprised when I say that conflict is damaging our world. So those are pretty much the three things I came away with, and my experience in therapy did for me. So that's pretty much where I left things off after the last episode. After part one, I got about as far as my work with Nathaniel Branden, very accomplished psychotherapist and author and former protege many years ago of Ayn Rand. Nathaniel Branden died about 1.5 years ago. So picking it up from there, I did a fair amount of work with Branden, but he was not the only person or therapist I worked with. I spent several years, it was probably about 3 years or so, in my, I guess it was my late 20s, in the Los Angeles area, which at the time, in the late 1970s, was I guess you'd call it a sort of a world center for all kinds of personal growth work. That's what they were calling it back then, the self-help movement. Just the idea that, as Paul Simon said in another one of his songs, the thought that life could be better is woven indelibly into our hearts and our brains, is another Paul Simon quote I like. I think that's from his Train in the Distance song. So I'll start this episode finally. After a lengthy preamble here, I'll talk a little bit about some of the other things I did and some of the other influences on me and people and ideas that helped me get to where I am today, and as I've said, helped prepare me for becoming the roommate coach. Probably the most important secondary, that's probably not the right way to put it, but in addition to Branden, another very important couple of therapists I had were Lee and Joyce Schulman. I believe they are still alive. I think they're retired. But at some point, Branden decided to quit doing therapy, individual therapy and group therapy, and he started what he called his intensives, were very large group weekend marathon session events. I think he generally had at least 100, maybe sometimes closer to 200 people in those, but he didn't do therapy anymore. He didn't have time for both, so he referred his clients, and I was one of them at the time, to a couple he had known for many years, Lee and Joyce Schulman, and I wound up getting into a therapy group with them for probably another year or so. They were just terrific people to work with. They were not the blindingly brilliant theoreticians that Branden was, as one of my cohorts in group years ago put it, but they were just so good working with people. They were just really warm and friendly and personable. And here's something that occurred to me, even though, again, these were highly trained PhD, fully licensed psychologists and psychotherapists. And yet, what I realized, I was kind of surprised when I began to realize this, that a lot of the time, what took place in their sessions, it would be once a week, we'd go to their home. They had a beautiful home on Mulholland Drive in Los Angeles. We'd spend 2 hours. There'd be maybe anywhere from 8, 10, maybe 12 of us. We would take turns just raising issues in our lives that we wanted to discuss. And it seemed like an awful lot of the time, probably at least half the time, maybe more than that, rather than being therapy, and sometimes it would turn into a serious therapy session. But a lot of the time, what would happen would be the person raising the issue, and many times that person was me. I got my money's worth from the group. It would just be a matter of getting some real good ideas on how to handle situations in life. And I think the point was that a lot of times, I know this was true for me, and I suspect it was true for some of the others there too, is that we were learning stuff that for a variety of reasons we just didn't have the opportunity to learn first time around when we were younger. I know in my case, and again, I suspect this is true for others, probably quite a few others. In my case, my parents were just too busy trying to come to grips with their own life. There was a lot of stuff that they just had not figured out, so they weren't in a position to teach it to me. So I grew up without some rather basic understandings of how to learn things. So it was kind of like a second chance. And I remember even back then thinking, gosh, this is an awfully valuable opportunity. And I began thinking, even when I was in that group, that, gosh, if only there was a way for this kind of information to be made more widely available. And again, this was another early precursor, I guess you'd say, to what is today my role as the roommate coach. The kind of information that I'm hoping to disseminate, to make available to anyone who is interested today as the roommate coach is in many cases very similar to the kinds of things that the Schulmans were explaining to us back in the day, way back then. I mean, for example, people would raise issues about problems they were having at work. You know, roommates are not the only people that have problems getting along with others. The workplace, as we all are many of us are painfully aware, can be a remarkably difficult place because of all the diverse personalities and everything. And that was a very popular topic. Now, just as I'm always repeating today as the roommate coach, I'm constantly giving the disclaimer that I'm not promising miracles and that every situation is different. There's no magic bullet, poor choice of words maybe. There is no magic potion that will automatically make every human interaction work properly. And the same was true for the Schulmans. They weren't able to promise that they would just give some magical advice and everything would be fine. It's more a matter of developing a mindset of just ways to approach situations in such a way that in the long run, they're more likely to get better than get worse. So that's what the Schulmans did, and that was one of the important things I did in my therapy, developing my philosophical attitudes about everything days. And I learned a tremendous amount from them, and I'm grateful to them, as a matter of fact. You're listening to The Roommate Coach. This is episode 8, the Roommate Coach Background, part 2. My name is Mark Lynn. This is KZZH 96.7 FM in Eureka, California. The motto here is world peace, one roommate at a time. And I know that sounds maybe a bit optimistic, but we are going to do our best to bring it about. Maybe not in the 7 billion plus world, but maybe just in your individual world with you and your roommates. That certainly would be a start. If you would like to leave any feedback about my motto or anything else about the show, you can do so at theroommatecoach.com. There's a contact link on the homepage, or you can leave a voicemail at 707-362-8000, 707-362-8000. If you're leaving a comment about a specific show and you remember to include the title of the show or the episode number, today's episode is number 8, as I mentioned, that will help me to put it into perspective and understand the what you're saying. But any and all comments are appreciated. The show is fairly new, and the station is fairly new for that matter, so it's nice to know that someone is listening, and hopefully we're doing some good here. Now, as I've said, this era in my life when I was doing therapy was a remarkably intense and exciting time for me, because it was, looking back on it, it was the time when I believe I really began to understand this admittedly complex and confusing world I had landed in. As I've mentioned, my early days were not real helpful in understanding things because they were pretty conflict-ridden. And again, I'm well aware that that's hardly unique. A lot of people have that experience. But at this time in my life, I began to understand it. My initial focus was the therapy-related because of the people I've discussed, the Nathaniel Branden and the Schulmans. But at some point, my desire to understand went beyond therapy. Therapy, by definition, was kind of directed internally at understanding myself and what was going on. Well, somewhere along the line, and I can't say that I made a conscious decision. I'm not trying to paint myself as Mr. Brilliant Guy here. A lot of this, I think, was just maybe dumb luck on my part. I had the good fortune to get myself to surround myself with some pretty intelligent people, and that helped a lot. But regardless, however I managed to do it, I began to shift my focus to the external world, realizing that both were important, the internal and the external. And I started to get an understanding of the social situation and ways in which our society seemed to contribute to and reinforce a lot of the difficulties that people were having. And by the way, that's one of the really neat things about the group therapy that I did, is I began to realize that, holy mackerel, it's not just me. And again, that's the trouble that I find. One of my pet peeves in life is the endless small talk. I mean, some of it's fine, and every conversation doesn't have to be profound. I understand that. But the social fact that most of the time we don't talk about things that really matter about what's going on in our lives, it's kind of easy to reach adulthood, which I did. I really did have this notion that, well, gosh, I wonder if anybody else feels like this. I doubt it. And that's the neat thing about therapy, is I began finding out, well, no, a lot of people felt like this. But my shift into awareness of and beginning to try to understand the external world was the importance of that was reinforced by my growing realization that, yeah, there's a lot of people out there that are having trouble. Now, one of the people who helped me to begin to understand the social side, the external side, not someone I met, but someone that I read quite a bit of. It was, and he's been gone for 20, 30 years now, the science fiction writer is very popular in the 60s and 70s and beyond, Robert Heinlein. His best-known book is probably Stranger in a Strange Land, but hardly his only. He wrote quite a few others, Time Enough for Love, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, I think became a movie. I'm not sure about that. And I could go on probably for hours just talking about some of the things I learned from Heinlein, but I'll just keep it to one particular saying of his that I quote on a regular basis that to me just explains so much about why we are so troubled as a species and why true happiness and peace and prosperity seem so rare in our world. I believe the quote was in the book Time Enough for Love. I'm not sure of that. But the quote was, and I quote, "Happiness is functioning the way a being is organized to function," end quote. And that's by Robert A. Heinlein. Now, again, this is something I read at a time when I was immersing myself in a number of other readings and authors and ongoing bull sessions, I guess you'd say, with friends and therapy groups and just all kinds of intense input to my young brain. So the way I began processing that statement, and here it is, 30, 40 years later, and I think I'd put it about the same way. I began to realize that we humans have, by virtue of just what we are and how we are designed, we need a certain kind of an environment in order to develop and to become what we're capable of becoming. Unfortunately, that's not the environment we have. We have a whole different kind of environment, and if the saying is accurate, if happiness is functioning the way a being is designed to function, the corollary of that would be that if a being is forced to function in ways that it's not designed to function, then that would be a prescription for the opposite of happiness. And it might sound a little trite, and maybe it is in some ways, but I do think there is something there. And again, the relevance of all this to roommate unhappiness and my notion that these problems can be at least helped, maybe they can't always be fixed entirely, but they can be helped, it rests on my conviction that the problems many of us have getting along with each other are not inherent. They're not just random and built into the nature of who we are, that they're a function of things we are doing wrong. And that's why I like that particular quote. The happiness is functioning the way a being is designed to function, to me sums up rather nicely the tremendous importance of living the life according to that you need to live based on what you are. If you bring a pet home from the store, it depends on what kind of pet it is. You bring home a canary, you're not going to put it in the goldfish bowl, and vice versa, or they wouldn't last very long. It's pretty obvious when it's a bird or a fish, maybe not so obvious when it's a human. But that quotation and some other things I read along those lines kind of got me on the path of understanding how our society affects us as individuals, and vice versa for that matter. Now, this idea of our society having a lot to do with why there is as much conflict as there is, that's a pretty popular theme with me, and it's something I will repeat and express in a variety of different ways pretty much probably throughout my career as the roommate coach. So I should probably take a minute here and explain why that is. I don't think it's automatically true that the understanding why something is the way it is essential to dealing with it. You might say, well, why not just talk about how to fix it? I mean, never mind the explanations. Well, here's my thinking about that and why I think it's really important. Is a lot of the time in our world when someone expresses frustration or unhappiness about something that many other people around them have kind of made peace with, and you might even say given up on fixing, what tends to happen is, and I know this to be true because it happened to me many times in my younger life, actually it still happens, is lots of times the response will just be, hey, that's just the way it is. You know, life's not fair, so who's happy? You can't do much about it. And more specifically, if your problem is a roommate that's giving you a bad time, frequently you'll just be told, well, you know, some people are just difficult. That's just the way it is. So the search for causes and the reason for looking for a cause is a good step along the way to finding a solution. The search for causes will frequently be short-circuited. And it's kind of a handy way to pretty much, like I say, short-circuit the entire quest. And I think there are reasons for that, which I'll get to in another show, maybe in the next show. It's looking like my roommate coach background is going to be maybe more than I had originally thought. At first, I thought I'd just do it in one show. This is 2, and it's still not done, so I'm going to need at least 1 more. But just to complete my thought there, that's why it's so important to me that I explain my thinking about why so many of these problems we have are pretty much built in, kind of baked into our society. As long as that is understood, then I think it's a lot more likely that someone might persevere in figuring out a way to do something about it. If the cause is just random or mysterious, or it's just inherent in our nature and you can't do anything about it, then you're a lot less likely to try. I don't think that's the case. I think there are identifiable causes, and because of that, there are identifiable solutions. And once again, that's my goal as the roommate coach, is to help people locate those solutions and implement them. Well, it looks like we're closing in on the 30-minute mark here. So I'm trying to keep these all in the vicinity of 30 minutes. That's a pretty good number. Somewhere along the line, I hope to get a regular time slot. I don't know. I think KZZH is still working out particulars, but I'm pretty sure that having a regular length, and my understanding is 30 minutes is kind of a standard, whatever the term would be, a standard time for regularly broadcast shows. So because of that, I'm going to wrap this one up here and keep it pretty close to the 30-minute figure, kind of get myself in that habit. So as I've said before, I'm the roommate coach, and you're listening to The Roommate Coach. This has been episode 8, which is part 2 of the Roommate Coach background. And the station is KZZH 96.7 FM in Eureka, California, brought to the air by Access Humboldt, accesshumboldt.net, and we really appreciate their efforts. They've done a fine job of bringing a new station here to Humboldt County and allowing the roommate coach to start talking to the nice folks in Humboldt County. The background music, the so-called bumper music, is called Rollin' at 5, and that's by Kevin MacLeod. My name is Mark Lynn, and you could leave feedback for me at theroommatecoach.com using the contact link on the homepage, or you could call area 707-362-8000, 707-362-8000. I always say it twice. That's a 24/7 voicemail line. And before I forget, once again, I like to repeat and emphasize my motto because I really mean it. The motto here is world peace, one roommate at a time. So in these troubled times where our future seems so uncertain, just know that someone is trying to do something about it, and we'll see how successful I wind up being. Anyway, thanks a lot for listening, and I'll talk to you again real soon.